All right, welcome everyone. Hope everyone's having a good conference so far. So this is going to be another blockchain-related talk. Definitely coming at it from a different angle than the previous speaker. So since I come from a attack detection background, I'll be talking about the blockchain sector as a general, but making an analysis on what type of hacks and attacks are happening in that sector and how different or not so different they are from other sectors that I've been covering in traditional security. So hopefully coming at it from this different angle will continue the conversation that just took place. So to give you a bit of a background on who I am, so I'm a detection and response investigator for Countercept, which is an MWR company. So we're basically a managed detection service where that is backed by endpoint detection and response technology. I also work as a purple team consultant, so doing attack simulations on client estates and basically assessing their security posture and then developing defensive measures for them. And I've tried to basically have accreditations that reflect these skill sets, because I'm a strong believer that anyone in security should be both offensively and defensively trained. And at the same time, in my own time, I sort of got into blockchain and studying the technology. So doing this talk today in Dubai, given that there's so much talk about blockchain, I thought I'd have a look at what's going on in that space and compare it to what's going on in cybersecurity. Because so far it seems that cybersecurity hasn't come into the conversation yet, in my opinion. I know there's a lot of sort of academic and theoretical talk about how the two might work together. But so far, when it comes to actual attack detection and looking at the threats that are out there, I don't see much difference. The only one being it's happening in a different sector. So I just want to give my view on how it's different and what it looks like from an attack detection perspective. So the agenda will be a brief look at the history of this sector from a security perspective, so looking at previous hacks and how they happened, why they happened, and what it looked like. Then looking at detection and response in blockchain, so looking at typical security incidents that happen in other sectors, and then looking at specific ones that are blockchain related and seeing how different they are. And then hopefully ending on some thought-provoking maybe questions around potential applications and data sources coming from blockchain that might be useful in cybersecurity. That are all my personal opinion. So to get right into it, we'll be covering sort of the history of hacks in blockchain. I picked some of the more famous ones, but also trying to reflect all the different types of hacks and what was different about them. So starting with Mt. Gox, by the way, all of these names that you're seeing on the left there, they're all basically cryptocurrency exchanges. And it's interesting that that's the case, because when I looked at all the hacks that are happening in that sector, they all end up having to do with some sort of exchange, because the goal for attackers is to cash out money. The money is the incentive. And it's not only for attackers, it's also for people that are in this space. Most of them are in it for the money rather than the technology. And I know that might be a bold claim to make, but just looking at hard facts, just the difference between 2017 and 2018 with the price going up and then the price going down, you can see that's all the evidence you need to see that money is a primary factor. It's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's just the state of things. So when it comes to these these compromises, they all target exchanges for a specific reason, as we'll go through them. So the first one was Mt. Gox, and in the 2011 to 2014 period, it controlled 80% of the market share when it came to trading cryptocurrencies. And their first compromise happened in 2011 when the Bitcoin protocol hadn't yet implemented encryption on wallet files. So the wallet files would hold the private keys, and those files were not encrypted. So a very simple sort of compromise on one endpoint from a user that had those files on their machine gave them access to the wallet files, and they weren't encrypted, so it gave them access to all the funds on the exchanges. The next thing they did, they just went on the exchange, dumped the coins and sold them at market price, which tanked the price all the way to 1 cent and then straight back up, because the person selling them didn't understand market liquidity, interestingly enough. And it was a small blip at the time because of how small the space was, but it actually had a ripple effect, because a few years later in 2014, that's probably the biggest hack that happened in the space, with about 850,000 Bitcoins being stolen. And in that case, it was a continuation of their estate having been compromised in the past, where the attackers now targeted their internal transaction system to basically transact all the coins out of their exchange. And we'll come to we'll go into more detail about how exchanges actually handle transactions as opposed to actual blockchain later on. Bitstamp, this one was started out as a phishing email coming through email, and then once the initial user was compromised, they've moved on to Skype, that was used as the internal messaging application inside the company to compromise more users. And once there was enough access gained through that way, they started compromising wallet files, and then again transacting coins out of the exchange. Bitfinex, this one was a multi-signature flaw. So multi-signature was a feature that came around this time and became popular, where to actually validate a transaction on an exchange, it would require more than one private key. So in this case, there was three private keys that were required. One of them was a third party. The two others were held by Bitfinex themselves. And it turned out that although in concept this is supposed to give more resilience to transactions being validated, there's no actual evidence of this being true. This is the best theory that's out there, because there was no disclosure about this even after the hack. But any transactions that Bitfinex was signed with their two keys, their third party, which was BitGo at the time, they held the third key. They would automatically just accept whatever Bitfinex validated. So Bitfinex had their private keys compromised. The hackers were signing transactions, and then their third party, which was holding that third critical key, would just automatically accept them, and it basically became a non-factor at that point. Gatecoin in 2016 was involved in one of the biggest smart contracts hacks that existed, that had to do with the DAO maker, which was the idea of having like a venture capitalist concept on the blockchain, where anyone could invest and interact with the smart contract to send funds. Part of that mechanism was actually refunding investors or paying out dividends to investors using that same contract. And there was a flaw where basically there was a recursive call function to the wallet to pull out the funds, but it would happen at such a speed that the wallet didn't have time to update its balance. So you could take out much more than what was available and basically double spend the number of coins that were in that contract. Another one was BitHump, and this one was purely a social engineering attack, where the employees that were working for BitHump, one of them got compromised. The customer details were pulled from that user, about 30,000 records, and then the attackers started using those records to contact those users, send them phishing emails, whatever may be the case, to increase their chance of them believing that it was BitHump contacting them, and then stealing users' coins rather than BitHump themselves. CoinCheck was another one, and this one targeted a hot wallet. So CoinCheck was offering obviously many cryptocurrencies to be traded, and most of them had cold wallets for those coins, right? And the hot wallets for trading. Now, one of the coins called NEM, they didn't have a cold wallet for that specific coin and held most of it in a hot wallet. And there was no multi-signature sort of authentication on that hot wallet. It was simply a case of compromising the private keys and then taking out all the coins that were in that hot wallet, because none of it was stored in cold storage. And finally, another one was Binance, although this wasn't a hack against Binance. It's just that part of the offering is to offer an API by which that allows bots to basically trade on the exchange through the API. So in this case, by default, some of the permissions on the API was to trade coins as well as just read transactions. And after this, in fact, they changed the default to only read and have to opt in to trade using the API permissions. But in this case, one of the most famous trading bots that was available at the time that was trading on Binance was compromised, and all the private keys for the users that were using it were stolen. And so then the attackers were using the bots to transact through the API on Binance and mess with a whole lot of coins. But basically, top down, you'll notice that there's not much that's specific to blockchain here, apart from maybe private keys for wallets, which you could substitute for maybe like passwords or two-factor authentication for standard for other industries. And this is probably the main point I'm trying to make with this talk is that the compromises that are happening in the blockchain space right now are not very much different from any other sector. What's different is that there's a lot of money involved. There's very low security maturity in this sector because all the money and all the focus is on either marketing or developing the technology, but there's no security involved at any stage. It's like an afterthought, which means that one of the main trends that is being identified is that attackers are simply repurposing the tools that they're using to compromise other sectors and just diverting it to blockchain because it's much more lucrative to do so, and the risk is the effort and risk is much lower. So to illustrate that, I use the word payload here rather loosely because it's not necessarily the traditional way of using that term, but the tool that's being used to start off these compromises will most likely be some sort of micro documents or some sort of payload that's shared through phishing. Phishing is still the most popular way of gaining a foothold inside an organization, at least from what I see from the attack detection side. You got things like clipboard stealers. In this case, they're popular because a lot of the transactions that happen currently need you to copy your wallet address into a certain field and then, click next. But because of the complexity of your wallet address, it's a lot easier to just copy the address and then paste it. Therefore, if you have some sort of clipboard capturing tool running on that user that's sending you back what's being copied, well, what the attackers are actually doing is substituting the wallet address that you copied with one of theirs. And then that means you're basically sending the funds to them instead of to the wallet that you're supposed to send it to. Another big one is crypto miners. So, again, it's the payload here, instead of it being like banking malware or, some sort of ransomware, it's a crypto miner. They literally just want to use your computer to mine cryptocurrencies. And here it's an extension to botnets. Like the point here is to have scale. So, push as much resourcing power, to the scale of the botnet to increase the hash rate and mine as many coins as possible. Smart contracts, API flows, and social engineering we covered. In terms of delivering this stuff, here's basically the one-to-one relationship between them. And you'll see that in terms of compromised credentials and private keys, again, that's not much different from compromising passwords. You just substitute in private keys here. And as soon as you have those, you have full access to transacting. And remember, in blockchain, as much as immutability and the fact that you can't reverse transactions is a plus, it's also a double-edged sword, because once those transactions go through, there's no way to get them back unless you hard fork a currency, which has happened in the past. Like in the DAO Maker case, they had to hard fork Ethereum into Ethereum Classic, and which exists to this day. So some of these impacts can have very radical ramifications. But the objectives here for the attackers is probably what's most different with blockchain, because when it comes to traditional sectors, it's a lot of it is based on the value of the data that is being compromised. Whereas here, you're gaining credentials for one, but the goal for that is to access private keys for wallets, especially hot wallets, because those are online. That's the difference between cold wallets, which are offline. CPU or GPU cycles, when it comes to mining, they want just the resource power of your machines. And then off-chain to on-chain transactions, which is that the point that I was trying to make earlier about Mt. Gox is that what people may not realize that when it comes to cryptocurrency exchanges, which are basically the bridge between, your money and the crypto assets, the transactions that are happening on the exchange, they happen on a normal database. They don't happen on chain. If they did, they would be really slow. They wouldn't be able to be instantaneous. So what actually happens is that the exchange has an order book that runs on a normal database. They do the transactions. Once they're finalized on that database, if you want to cash out your coins, then the transaction happens on the blockchain. So the goal for attackers is to compromise your accounts on those exchanges, because that's the only way for you to cash out the money. And once they get access to that, it's to make those transactions happen on the chain, which means transferring your assets out of the exchange, which is why the main target right now is exchanges. And on the other hand, it's just end users when it comes to things like running crypto miners on as many machines as possible, or just to get access to their private keys and private wallets to then go and use on exchanges. So when it comes to detection and response, which is where most of my personal expertise comes in, we've come across various incidents that had to do with cryptocurrencies in one way or another. In here, I'm going to use crypto miner example, and you realize that it's not much different. For those of you who have some experience dealing with this sort of instance, you realize that the attack path is not much different than attacks in other sectors. So in this case, I'm very much talking about a proactive way of finding threats, which is usually referred to as threat hunting. I believe one of the speakers is doing a talk on that tomorrow, but I've done previous talks on threat hunting at Hack in the Box if you want to look up those. But in this case, you're assuming that you're collecting all as much information from the endpoints as possible, one of them being the process data and the command line arguments that are seen, which would show you something like this, right? You've got command executing a command to connect to an FTP server and log into it, grab a file, write it on disk, and close, and then run that file. This, in this case, was running the payload that was downloaded by the user from a phishing email. And I'll come back to why phishing emails are so especially prevalent in blockchain later on. But continuing from that, you get the typical step of enumerating what's going on the system to establish persistence. In this case, it's checking the permissions on the different paths on the system to see where it can write further payloads. And it does that by running a PowerShell command to check what type of operating system the malware is finding itself on, and then deciding what secondary payload to download. And this is where you see your first evidence of this being crypto mining related, because it connects back to a server here. And if you go and look up what this results to and what this is related to just using OSINT, you'll find that it's related to a mining pool. Because, again, one of the things that is being pushed as an advantage for blockchain is that it's transparent, it's public. Well, the thing with that is that it means that everyone can see what's going on, and if you're using it for nefarious purposes, well, everyone can see that as well. So in this case, mining pools are not in themselves inherently bad, but when they're used in this sort of scenario where you're compromising accounts and hacking into them to then run code for you, well, then it does become illegal. So you get information about the mining pool there. You might pull the payload and do analysis on it to find more information about what's in there. And one of the things that you'll find is hard-coded configurations for the wallets that the cryptocurrencies are being mined to, plus references to users and passwords, and specific information about which mining pool or which node on the mining pool this is talking back to. And this gives you your first opportunity to do something that's different than investigating usual incidents, which is chain analysis. So again, going back to how this is all transparent, it's very easy to go and track from that point on where funds are moving between wallets. And you know that eventually the goal is to cash out for money. So it's going to have to move to an exchange of some kind. It doesn't matter how many hops they go between from the initial wallet to the exchange. And at that point, they have to cash out to some sort of money. So the records for exchanges are very much transparent, and it's easy to tell wallets that belong to exchanges. So if you remember the whole ransomware period from last year, attackers were asking for Bitcoin for payments, and it became more difficult to them as people were doing more chain analysis when it came to investigating these incidents where the funds would go to a certain wallet and then all eyes were on that wallet. So it's hard to start moving it without, giving yourself up, which is why they moved more to privacy coins. And that's a whole different discussion. But essentially they have to go through exchanges. So that can be used against them to find out where the funds are going and who they may be. So as a typical instance finishes, you remediate the host. And in this case, you can report to the mining pool, which this is the equivalent of basically going to some sort of central authority and telling them these guys are doing something bad. In this case, the mining pool is centralized, is someone who is, aggregating, is allowing you to join their pool and be part of a large hashing power to give you more chance at mining blocks. And if you mine the block, you're guaranteed more rewards, and then those get splitted out to the people that are part of the pool. It's better than mining on your own because you have less chance of actually successfully mining a block on some of these popular cryptocurrencies, especially Bitcoin. When it comes to a typical timeline, again, from a response perspective, it does take a long time to set up proper operations around hacking a company. It doesn't matter if it's crypto related or not. The part where this might diverge is when it comes to exchanges. It's actually a lot easier once you get access to private keys, which is, like I said, the equivalent to credentials, to start doing whatever you want. And there's very little in-depth defense within exchanges to have any sort of controls over what happens once an attacker gets hold of your private keys. And attackers spend a lot of time actually learning the system, just getting a lay of the land, seeing what's going on a day-to-day operations to strategize the exit strategy. Because when it comes to, again, like I said, moving transactions offline to on-chain, cryptocurrency exchanges actually have a lot of power when it comes to how much funds can move out of any given account. You'll see if you have any sort of cryptocurrency account, they have limits set on accounts, and there needs to be certain amounts of users to allow you to move more funds than what's usual for certain accounts. When it comes to mass hacks, attackers are trying to cash out thousands of Bitcoins. Well, usually there's going to be defenses against that unless you've got an understanding of the back end and you've compromised that, and then you can do whatever you want. So when it comes to achieving the objective for attackers here, it's very much about money, and it brings up a good discussion just about what's driving this whole sector right now and how that's driving, it's putting a target on its back basically, because there's so much money involved, the security standards are low, which means attackers are making it their favorite target. At the same time, there's a lot of actual development work happening. People are trying to innovate in this space, but it's getting overclouded by this, the hacks that are happening every few months and reducing the credibility of the actual work that's being done at a technological level. So what are the sort of potential, uses for blockchain in cybersecurity? It's a discussion that I'm interested in having with people because I would like to have an idea ahead of time, because it's definitely not ready today, but it will come at some point about, what we can use this technology for. And as far as I'm concerned right now, the first step is not actually to use the technology ourselves. It's just to come in and almost like provide our current services to blockchain companies and say, okay, like we'll help you with the security while you work on operating your business or developing the code, because you can't do it yourself. The problem again goes back to the current mentality in the in this sector is that every dollar that you have, you might as well put it towards marketing, because that will create hype and increase the value of your token, which means more money. And a lot of exit scams happen left and right, where creators of projects, for them it's a win-win. If they get hacked or some critical flaw happens, they're not losing necessarily, because they've already made their money. And if they succeed, well, as they can keep pushing, the marketing hype and riding that wave to make more money, even if the underlying security is not there and the risk is there. Well, it doesn't really matter to most projects. It's not every project out there. So the real question that you need to start with is, do I need a blockchain? And there was a great paper written by West and Gervais, which is only 3 pages long, but that's all it needs to be to understand whether you need a blockchain in your specific sector. And they give this sort of flowchart to follow through. But definitely a question that I asked myself, and I tried to look at, what sort of use cases are being proposed out there. Some of them are right down ridiculous. Like, I think the most ridiculous one I found was this one, like the blockchain toilet. Apparently that needs to be a thing. So, they have this portable toilet provider that has all these different things about it that can be networked and put on a blockchain. And somehow, this was pushed as a marketing event, for the cryptocurrency that was partnered with them, which was Tron. And, drove up the price, but this is the use case. And do you really need it? Probably not. At the end of the day, it only affected the price, and that's what people cared about. So when it comes to actual implementation, I think the first thing to understand is that there's different types of blockchains. The previous speaker touched on this. Permissionless blockchain is what you know as Bitcoin and proof of work, which, in my opinion, Bitcoin is the only legitimate proof of work chain, because it's the most decentralized, it's the longest running chain. Any other chain that comes after that, or any other proof of work chain, is just not as secure and not as decentralized. Therefore, it's void. And eventually, Bitcoin will implement every use case that you see out there trying to be developed by other companies. The technology is the same. Therefore, Bitcoin will implement it at some point. It's just that Bitcoin is not as fast and risky about what it implements in its code. It's actually very disciplined and structured about what it does. So when it comes to actually implementing technology in different sectors, another question that was asked in the previous talk was when it comes to like government or things like that. There's other types of blockchains that are more private or that are more permissioned, which is more useful for the use cases that have to do with businesses running, using this technology for their business. You don't want it to be public. You need it to be private. You need it to be permissioned. But then that raises the question of, if it's permissioned, it's therefore centralized. Therefore, the weak link in the chain just moves up to whatever central authority is for that blockchain. So in the case of a private permission blockchain, that will be some sort of masternode on the system that ultimately validates the transaction. And if you have control of that, then you have control of the entire blockchain. Therefore, the point there is not to have the decentralized aspect of blockchain. It's literally just to have the immutable ledger. And then you need to consider, well, if you have an immutable ledger, then, what data is being fed into that? Can I reliably say that whatever data is going into this blockchain is correct? Because again, it's a double-edged sword. If correct data is going in, it can't be changed. But if bad data is going in and corrupted data is going before it gets in there, well, you can't change it. This is one of the simplest attack paths for this for this sort of implementation. It's like one of the supply chain use cases is like a refrigerated truck that transports medicine at the right temperature. Well, the sensors that are taking in the temperature readings within the van, they can be compartmentalized in their own little box that has the right temperature, and the rest of the van is running at normal temperature. And there's the data that's being fed back in from the sensor is still the correct data, but it's not reflecting the actual physical conditions. So bridging the physical conditions to the blockchain is just one example of how the immutability of the blockchain and the reliability of the data that goes in is not as simple as most people think. And in my opinion, a lot of the time, the answer is you do not need a blockchain. And what should be happening right now is more of like pilot programs and maybe playing with the technology itself to understand it. And as time goes on, maybe start to implement those things in a useful way, which will happen in the future. I actually don't have my timer running. Can you update me on time?
There was a really big hand on the floor. So
oh, sorry. I was not looking at it. I was trying to follow this. Well, I'll finish up right here. So this is my view on what is most useful. I would say operating systems is something that people should be focusing on, because if the data coming into the blockchain is what's most important, then actually there's operating systems out there that are being built on the blockchain which secures your data before it actually goes into it. I'd recommend people reading to that. It's very interesting. You've got chain analysis, like I said, which in terms of attack detection gives you the most intel about incidents that have something to do with blockchain, and you can actually gain actionable intelligence from that. So just to conclude, here's my conclusion. Security breaches in the blockchain space happen in the same way as other sectors. The main targets in that sector are exchanges and retail user machines, because that's what offers the most monetary reward for attackers. And the best data source, like I said, is malware analysis. When you get a malware sample that has to do with this type of attack, you get a lot of information from it, and as well as chain analysis to track the transactions when attackers try to cash out on this. And data immutability and just decentralization are definitely the main benefits, but they're also double-edged. And the main drawbacks are the fact that the tech maturity and the amount of developers that can develop this technology in a secure way are not in, there's not many of them around. So on this note, I'll definitely finish. I don't know how long I'll overrun, but I've put some references and I'll be available for any questions after the talk.
Yeah, we are a bit over time already, so we'll have to skip the questions.